This is week 4, social identity development and sexual identity development. There are several social movements that have really influenced student development. In the 1960s, when the civil rights movement took off, several scholars were prompted to develop models of development for students of color. We saw Cross's theory of black identity, and this was really the first time that we were seeing a distinct difference between students of color and white students in terms of identity development. In the 1970s, the emergence of the women's movement brought about several models related to gender. Carol Gilligan did quite a bit of work looking at women's ethic of care. And she also wrote a very well-known text called In a Different Voice, where she sought to disprove Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral reasoning, where he indicated that young women reached a lower level of moral reasoning than young men. And she pointed out the study was skewed because it was only made up of men, or it was made up mostly of men. And in the 1970s, we also saw the gay rights movement really emerging and the impact that it had on students, because for the first time it portrayed gay and lesbian students as a minority group. So these three particular movements were definitely influential on student development and certainly on the emergence of several theories related to these particular movements. The 1980s and 1990s brought quite a bit of attention for individual cultural models. In 1984, Banks developed the multi-ethnic model, followed by Atkinson, Morton, and Sue in 1989, focusing on minority development. And then in the 1990s, they focused on development within each ethnic group. Finney, developed an ethnic identity development model, followed by Helms and Carter focusing on white identity development, Kim focusing on Asian identity development, and Torres focusing on Latino identity development. So giving recognition to differences and changes within development for different ethnic groups. The 20th century surfaced a focus on multifaceted identities. Researchers began to note the complexity of overlapping issues. As Evans and her colleagues noted in the book, identity is no longer viewed as made up of separate components, but rather as intertwined and unique for each individual. And I know throughout this course we've talked so much about individual development and considering each student unique, and this is so true, and I think this idea really supports that. Some students come to us with these multiple layers of development, and we really have to consider all these different components as a piece of this larger whole. The conversation about student development really has no legs to stand on if you don't consider the impact of oppression and privilege. Researchers have found that inequality has a highly negative impact on students. When students are oppressed, they're unable to develop. And this has tremendous implications on student affairs practitioners, because our goal in higher education, our aim is to help students be successful, to help them grow and develop. And so anything that would keep students from that would cause us to miss that aim of higher education. Oppression is perpetuated by privilege. So privilege, whether that's marked by a student being a white student or heterosexual, Christian, middle class, any of these characteristics. Actually, I really love Evans et al., the definitions that's cited in Evans et al. That says that privileged students have a weightless knapsack of special provisions, assurances, tools, maps, guides, code books, passports, visas, clothes, compasses, emergency gear, and blank checks. It's so powerful. I just think about, the difference between a first generation student applying to college and a student who comes from a background where both their parents have gone to college, and they grew up in a culture that college was just a way of life. They had heard about it and they knew about it. And when it came time to look at schools, their parents took them on several, visits of campuses and maybe helped them fill out the FAFSA or, looked for scholarships versus the first generation student who really didn't have those kinds of supports and resources going into applying for college. And a lot of times they say that students who come from a place of privilege really aren't able to see. They just don't really get that their privilege has that kind of impact. And, they talk about the end goal being to act on what you learn. And I think that in order to do that, students really have to accept their role in oppression. They have to have this feeling of guilt. They have to know that, you know, that somebody else did not have the same advantages that they had, and kind of reflect and redefine, learn from it. What does that mean? And then they can act on what they learn. They can, you know, try to make that right. And as student affairs professionals, we try to champion for those students who are experiencing oppression. And so that's what the ability is to really impact our campuses. This next section was a little bit harder to cover because I know we probably have people who are coming from a variety of angles on this subject. But ultimately, we have students on our campuses, whether that's at Messiah or, a community college or a four-year public institution, who are experiencing very real challenges as a result of their sexual identity. Research tells us that gay teens are 5 times more likely to attempt suicide than their heterosexual peers. So there are very real challenges associated with sexual identity development. So I felt like it was important for us to talk about as we're trying to consider the whole student and all these different facets of development. I do want you to know that I know Messiah has a clear stance on homosexual behavior, and I'm fully in support of that. I just felt like it was important for us to cover this because we do have students who are going to be moving through some of these stages, and so having this information will be helpful. Vivian Cass first developed a model called the Homosexual Identity Formation Model in 1979, and then she updated it in 96 based on clinical work with gays and lesbians in Australia. She describes 6 stages of perception and behavior and emphasized that not all students progress through all the stages. In stage 1, identity confusion, this is a student's first awareness that their behavior or feelings could be labeled as gay or lesbian. They might experience a range of emotions such as curiosity, confusion, or anxiety. In stage 2, identity comparison, students have accepted that they might be gay or lesbian, but they haven't shared it with anyone. This is often marked by a time of isolation or loneliness, and if you think about how they're trying to balance academics on top of everything else, it can be a very challenging time for students. In stage 3, identity tolerance, students have acknowledged that they are gay or lesbian and seek out other gay or lesbian peers to reduce their feelings of isolation. They might look for groups online or on the campus. In stage 4, identity acceptance, they're spending more time with gay and lesbian peers, and they're figuring out how to disclose their sexuality to their heterosexual peers. They might share with a few of them, but they're not really ready to share it with the world. They're still figuring out how to present themselves in mainstream heterosexual society. And this can be compounded depending on the level of acceptance for the environment for which they're in. In stage 5, identity pride, we see that students have activism and confrontation with a society or environment that is opposed to their sexual orientation. They might formally join an advocacy group or, identify with a group on Facebook or post gay pride flag or something in their room or on their car to identify with this as who they are. And then in stage 6, identity synthesis, the worlds are less dichotomized. The public and private worlds become more congruent. I had a very interesting conversation in grad school with a friend of mine who was gay, and somehow we got to comparing. I was talking about my faith, and he was talking about being gay, and he said to me, he said, "Your faith is different because every time you make a decision, I feel like you consider your faith as the way that you make the decision." And he said, "But my being gay is different because I don't consider every question that I have based on my sexuality." He said, "It's only really parts of what I decide." So I thought that was so interesting that he saw his sexuality as a piece of who he was, but it didn't encompass everything. And so I think of sort of representing this identity synthesis stage. So all of these stages are important to understand because it gives us this picture of what students might be experiencing. This obviously doesn't categorize every student. It doesn't perfectly tell us the story for every gay or lesbian student, but it does give us a picture or a better understanding for this experience.